Refresh rate is the amount of times per second that your TV or monitor can display a new frame. This is measured in hertz. Frame rate is the amount of times per second your gaming device can pump out a new frame. This is measured in frames per second. Sometimes, especially on these lower powered devices, the refresh rate of the display is so high, the game can't even come close to the refresh rate of the display. So why even use a high refresh rate display to begin with? There is, of course, variable refresh rate, which could help a lot in these situations, but not every device has that. And what if we want the full refresh rate of the screen that we have? Also, I just don't want to talk about variable refresh rate in this video. It's not about variable refresh rate, okay? I've seen a few people get excited about these low-powered retro handhelds coming out with pretty high refresh rate displays, up to 120 hertz. Even my ROG Ally X, a pretty beefy handheld gaming PC, rarely if ever reaches that full 120 hertz that the display is capable of. Even modern video games often struggle to get past 60 frames per second on consoles. So why even bother with anything above 60 hertz in a display? Doesn't that seem like a waste? It's even rumored that the new Nintendo Switch 2 that we'll be hearing more about in a week might even have a 120 hertz display in there. I think that would be a pretty insanely progressive thing for Nintendo to do. I don't think it's very realistic, but hopefully they do. Hopefully in a week they announce that and I look like a big fool. Despite what I've been saying, it's actually really cool to have a high refresh rate screen like that. Just for the baseline, high refresh rates are cool because visually they can look really smooth. Sometimes animations can look pretty wild at high refresh rates. Here I am looking at a monitor that's refreshing at 540 hertz, and it looks absolutely insane. Obviously, there are diminishing returns, so the higher up you go, the more minute the improvement. 120 or 240 is kind of the max before it starts to all look the same. But higher frame rates are preferred because of the faster inputs. Most games read your inputs on a cycle that is tied to each frame. So if the game is running at 30 frames per second, your inputs are only registering 30 times per second. If your game is running at 120 frames per second, well then, there's a lot more frames for your inputs to be registered on. And having a display that can keep up just helps smooth things out even more. It's the ideal experience. This is why high frame rates are sought after. But obviously, higher frame rates puts a higher load on the device. These devices are working really hard to pump out all of those frames, and 120 frames per second is really high. These things can barely reach that in any game. So take a low-power device like the Anbernic 35XX SP and the 34XX, for example. These are as low-powered as you can get. Both have 120 hertz screens. Why? Honestly, I couldn't really get this to work great on there. But let's look at the Odin 2 Portal, which also has a 120 hertz screen. An Android handheld built specifically for retro games with a 120 hertz screen. I thought this was pretty stupid when it was first announced. What am I gonna do? Play the Dead Cells Android app at 120 hertz? This device isn't even any different than the previous Odin 2s that I already like, besides the fact that it's got a big 120 hertz OLED screen. And sure, it's a nice screen, but what the hell am I gonna do with it? There are actually two ways we can fully utilize this 120 hertz screen on these low-powered devices. The first one is, believe it or not, retro games. That's right, Super Nintendo games, which never ran any higher than 60 frames per second, can actually look really cool, even at 60 frames, on these lower devices with some tomfoolery. Even N64 games that almost never hit 30 frames per second in most games, even at the time, can look really cool on here. These are all thanks to some really clever CRT filters. It turns out that upping the frame rate leaves the door open for some really cool tricks that can give us some pretty convincing CRT effects. This video might jump around in frame rate a little bit. It might be a little jarring if you're watching this, but I wanted to try to show you as accurately as possible what these high refresh rate screens will look like. It's still not going to be exactly accurate to what I'm seeing with my naked eye, but it's as close as we can get on YouTube. The second reason I've been liking these high refresh rate screens on these low-powered devices is, believe it or not, game streaming. I've been playing the new Assassin's Creed Shadows on my ROG Ally X, and it runs like absolute ass. Low frame rates, the frame dips are harsh because there already aren't a lot of frames to go around, and you are losing out on all that beautiful ray traced lighting. It looks pretty rough, and it plays even rougher. Honestly though, tweaking some settings can get it to a playable state. It's like fine, but it's still not the ideal way to play. It still feels like you're missing out. But the game runs a lot better on desktop. Obviously, there's a whole desktop graphics card in there. But if you have a desktop gaming PC already, you can just take the game from there and beam it over to your handheld. Now you got the full frame rate that your desktop would get, and you even get up to 4K if you want. I just stick to 1080p because that's all that my handhelds are capable of anyway. I've been pretty harsh when talking about streaming services in the past, and this is why. A free service that can get you this much quality with this little latency, shouldn't this be the standard? So these are the ways that we can get the most out of our high refresh rate handhelds. Obviously, there's some lower powered games that can hit the full threshold, but if you want to take full advantage, we can use filters to make our retro games look pretty insane, or we can just outsource the load these high-powered games demand elsewhere, so we can crank that frame rate all the way up. This video is sponsored by me. Buy some merch. We got a nice glow-in-the-dark shirt. We got these Wulff Den podcast shirts. We got the retro hoodie. We also got desk mats and some cortado cups and some nice hot coffee cups. Go to wulffdenapparel.com, buy some merch. We'll start with the way that modern high refresh rate displays can mimic CRT TVs. If you're watching this on one of these high refresh rate displays right now, you can just go to this website or click the link below, and it can show you just how well it can emulate an old CRT display. It won't translate well on camera, but you can kind of see how this shader can mimic the way CRT TVs would draw an image. So it's something that we might soon see widely used in emulators. And also, these shaders will get better over time. Right now, we're just going to use something called black frame insertion. The concept is very simple. Most of these retro games run at a max of 60 frames per second, and that's all well and good. But what if we just add a black frame for every other frame? If we have a 120 hertz display, we can do this while still maintaining the full 60 frames per second, because that's how math works. You would think that this would make these games look worse, but for some reason, it doesn't. For some reason, it allows the display to completely eliminate the motion blur that modern displays normally give, giving you the smooth motion you would normally get on a CRT. You can kind of see it in this B-roll clip, but I promise it's much more impressive in person. And it's easy enough to enable. In RetroArch, you go to Settings, Video, Synchronization, and just turn on black frame insertion. That should be all you need to do. On this Odin 2, I had to toggle smooth display on and off for it to work sometimes for some reason. But now we have smooth visuals in our retro games. This is Sonic 3 with the wide mod on at 120 hertz with black frame insertion. To take it a step further, now that we have the CRT motion, let's get the full CRT look. And the easiest way to do this is to just use RetroArch's baked-in CRT shaders. After messing around with a bunch of them, my favorite is just CRT Geom. You can find this by going to Quick Menu, Shaders, Load Preset, Shaders GLSL, CRT, CRT Geom. Then click Apply. You can also just mess around with a bunch of shaders until you find one that you like. You can also download some if you want. But I like this one a lot. I really like the colors. They're bright and the contrast is high to compensate for those scan lines. It also has a subtle warping like you would see in the curved glass of an old tube TV. It's awesome. It's especially awesome with these widescreen mods because now you're looking at a wide CRT. What could be cooler than that? I'm going to be throwing a lot of numbers at you. I'm filming this in 24 frames per second because that's like the cinematic look. Most of my videos are like that. Some of this B-roll is shot in 60 frames per second because that's kind of the highest you can get on YouTube. These screens are 120 hertz. So this video cannot go up that high unless I shoot it at 120 frames per second and just slow it down, but that defeats the purpose. And no, you can't double speed the YouTube video. It will still show you a 60 frames per second video. The reason I say all that is because in some of these shots, you might see some weird artifacts, like, for example, this big black bar that diagonally scrolls across the screen. That's just an artifact of the frame rate of the camera mismatching the refresh rate of the screen. That's not there in real life with your real eyeballs. Anyway, this black frame insertion also works great for N64 games, which are usually only 30 frames per second at most. This is still using the exact same preset, and the motion looks crisp and brilliant just like it would on a CRT. And the same even goes for Sonic Adventure 2, a Dreamcast game. So you really only need to apply these presets once to have them work in all your RetroArch games, if that's what you want. This is the way I want to play my retro games now. It's pretty awesome. Just when you thought emulation technology couldn't advance anymore, here we are. And I'm realizing now I didn't put it on there. The next thing that I've been messing around with a lot more recently is game streaming. This is something I messed around with a little bit with Steam Link, but a lot of people have been telling me about it, and I just never really saw the need for this. I actually jumped into Marvel Rivals on this Odin 2 portal just for a little goof, just to see the refresh rate. And again, it kind of blew me away. I still like my Odin 2 Mini more. I like mini consoles. But even I have to admit, this was pretty cool. And then I left it at that. But I did think about it when I was messing around with Assassin's Creed Shadows on my ROG Ally X. Yeah, I got a lot of doohickeys and tchotchkes to play video games on. That's kind of the whole point of this channel. You should subscribe sometime. I messed around with a bunch of settings to get Assassin's Creed to run decent on my Ally X. Everything is on low. The resolution is turned down slightly and frame gen is on. And I'm still only getting somewhere around 40 frames per second. Sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less. And it looks fine. I could totally play like this. But like, this is supposed to be a beautiful game. It's the first Assassin's Creed to not also be on last gen's hardware. I want to be able to see it in all its glory. I have other devices that I can use to play this game in all of its glory. I could get it on my PlayStation 5. I can also beam it from the PlayStation 5 to my PlayStation Portal, but that's only going to be 60 frames per second. And I already bought it on Steam, so I'm already screwed. But why not use my desktop PC? It has a 4070 Super in it now. Certainly this game can look pretty good on that, and it does. With these settings, it runs and looks pretty fantastic. I think this is a good compromise between high quality lighting and graphics and also high frame rates. If you own more than one device to play Steam games on, you might notice every once in a while, Steam will give you the option to play a game that is not installed on the system that you're using. Instead of play, this little button turns into stream. You can just stream your game over your network to your device. And just like that, it works pretty decent. This is just Steam remoting into your other device, like a remote desktop client. But it does it with really high quality video with super fast refresh rate, and the input lag is not noticeable at all. But it's streaming, so every once in a while there's a hiccup. I wouldn't trust this for like a ranked competitive match. But for a single player game like Assassin's Creed, this solves the current problem that I have. I would just suggest that you make sure that your speakers are off on the gaming PC you're going to be using. Otherwise, you might accidentally wake up your dog. And you can do this with any device with Steam on it, or even an Android handheld with just the Steam Link app. But there are some issues with Steam Link. For example, it's just a remote desktop application. So almost every time you load up a game, something breaks. It almost always just has me staring at the desktop. Sometimes the game will open and it just won't show me that window. Sometimes I gotta go downstairs to my PC and do some bullshit to get it to work right. But then it does and it's fine. I just noticed myself doing a lot more finagling with this than I would have liked, considering how easy it looked when it just told me to tap a button to stream it. So many people have been suggesting Moonlight to me, and I always thought, why would I use a third-party app when Steam has something built in right there for me to use, ready to go? And now I completely understand why everyone was screaming at me. Moonlight is an app. You can get it on Steam Deck or Bazite by just downloading and installing the Flatpak from their GitHub on desktop mode and then making it a non-Steam game. You can get it on your PC handheld the same way, just get the exe file instead on Windows. Hell, you can even get it on 3DS. It's a different GitHub, but you can get it anywhere at this point. Moonlight is the client app that you want to put on the system that you want to stream the game on. Sunshine is the host app that you want to put on your gaming PC. The first time you boot up Moonlight, it'll recognize that you have Sunshine on your gaming PC. If you click on your gaming PC, it'll ask you to input a code on that gaming PC. That way your neighbor doesn't just log into your computer and start, I don't know, doing your taxes for you. Then you want to give all of your devices a good restart. I had to do this several times for it to work on my 3DS. But then, remoting into your system, just open Steam in big picture mode, which is way easier to navigate with your handheld. In fact, everything about this remote play experience is way better in Moonlight. Since you're in big picture mode, you can choose to turn off your gaming PC when you leave it or when you're done. And the streaming quality is also great. There were still dips at times, but I honestly don't want to knock it too much considering it's giving me 1080p, 120 frames per second.
I don't quite understand why, but streaming with Steam Link was only getting me 60 frames, like locked, and this Moonlight is getting me up to 100.
I can even go higher than that if I want to, but I set it limited to 1080p 120 because that's what my Ally X is capable of, and I don't need any more than that. There are a lot more settings you could tweak too, but this is all that I need. And this is how I've been playing through Assassin's Creed around the house. I don't like being tied to my gaming PC or a console on my TV when I'm playing a single player game like this. I'd rather have it on a handheld so I can play it wherever I want. And honestly, it doesn't feel like I'm streaming it at all, except maybe once every 10 minutes when it reminds me that I'm definitely streaming the game. I think the reason why I'm more forgiving here than I am on, say, like the PlayStation Portal is because this thing can play its own games too. If I really wanted to, I can just play Assassin's Creed on here. It just wouldn't have the nice lighting. Big whoop. I also fully understand that this type of setup is completely unrealistic for a lot of people. First of all, it requires you to have a handheld that can have up to 120 hertz refresh rate on the screen. And that's already a couple $100 right there. Then it also requires you to have a pretty beefy gaming PC, the most expensive of gaming purchases. If you're in that boat, you should look into GeForce Now. In my experience, streaming from a cloud service is sometimes better than streaming locally between devices in your own house. But of course, that can change depending on your home internet speeds. If you have slow internet or low bandwidth from your service provider, streaming locally on your own network would be ideal. But most people these days can handle cloud streaming. It requires a lot less bandwidth than you might think. GeForce Now is the only streaming service that I could see that can handle frame rates of up to 120 frames per second. And look at that, they even have Assassin's Creed Shadows on there. I have to admit, I was wrong about these high refresh rate devices. I thought it was a gimmick. I thought they were just trying to pump up all the numbers on the spec sheet to make it look like this device was better than the last one they just made. But no, these high refresh rates actually are useful for a few things. This is how I want to play retro games now. This is also how I want to play very demanding modern AAA games now. Kind of both ends of the spectrum are covered here. I do hope that the next Switch has a high refresh rate screen. I don't have my fingers crossed for that because Nintendo loves to use old hardware, but wouldn't that be fucking awesome? So what do you guys think? Did this open your mind to high refresh rates? Have you already had your mind open? What have you been using these sorts of devices for? Leave it in the comments below. At me on Twitter. Any and all of this other social media garbage. Also, come to a live stream. You could just talk to me live in the chat. That's the best way to do it. Come on, go to wolfdenapparel.com. We got so many things over there, like this shirt. It glows in the dark. Bet you didn't know that unless you saw the beginning of the video. Hey, if you want to help the channel for free, all you have to do is subscribe right here and share this video with a friend who has a high refresh rate device like this and isn't fully utilizing it to its full potential. Thank you very much. Have yourself a very good week.